Today, we want to have a discussion, a moment of reflection on a mainstream assumption about Western thought, Western thinking, and Western practices. And when we said West, we are talking about particularly Europe, what you would call Western Europe. The assumption that major domains of thought practices, and particularly in the area of democracy and governance, has to reflect, and deeply so, Western tradition. The assumption is that Western tradition has provided us with a solid and foundational values, or what we would call democratic values, and governance values to which we have to constantly look to. We want to present a systematic contestation into this mainstream assumption, with the hope that finally we begin to reread Western scholarship, and the rereading not only to know a lot better, but with a critical mind to begin to identify the gaps, to begin to identify the inconsistencies, and give room to other sets of knowledge, to other corners of knowledge in the knowledge field building, and in this area of democracy and governance. Today, I want to make an attempt for a systematic study of John Locke as a case of Western thought, or Western classical thought, and particularly his corpus, second treatise on civil government, to elaborate my thesis. And as we did say, the thesis is how to reread Western scholarship with a mind of a critical thinking, to identify inconsistencies in their thought, and begin to understand the history, the setting, the motivations for which these thoughts were built. And once we are able to succeed, then we begin to notice that after all, Western scholarship does not provide us a complete sphere of knowledge, but that it is an aspect of knowledge within particular ideologies, within particular histories, within particular interests. And that allows us, as other knowledge corners, to begin to contribute to this debate or discussion on governance and democracy. John Locke's writings as a pioneer in political text in constructing an enduring so-called democratic governance institutions of the state and government have been argued by his students as a revolutionary germ that has created a sea of change in the political theory and eventually liberal democracy. It is argued that his thought swings as a double-edged sword that touches on major issues of human rights, political equality, good governance, and democracy. Accordingly, he is termed as a great scholar of modern democracy that has composed a thought as complete, exhaustive, and conclusive in the area of democracy and governance. Whatever that means, and begs the question, what my concern at this point is to reread and recast a little more critical look at this perennial honeymoon that Locke has enjoyed over time. And the task is not only to strip him of the honeymoon as such, lest it will be read as jealousy set in motion. Instead, what I seek to do here is to redeem us, to realize that Locke was instead an ideologue propping a position. As an ideologue, John Locke probes a bourgeois system, a system of a state whose governance and democracy was built on the logic of exclusion and consequently founded on the structures and institutions of the power that be. A power whose legitimacy was cunningly sourced from the excluded people and unto which it purports service and common good. At the same time, preserving so-called representative government and elite governance that in their own inclusive setting accommodates each other as a class in a brokered political power sharing in the form of the executive, legislature, and the judiciary. This act is not by any means an aspect to reinforce the idea of democracy and good governance, but rather as a measure that was used and thought through carefully and cunningly to quench the political thirst of the ruling elite struggling for positions. And he gave them positions. You can become an executive, don't fight. You can become a legislature, don't fight. And another group of people may become the judiciary, don't fight. Consequently, I seek here to indulge in this insight by showing the rhetoric and predictability that John Locke is akin to and his actual goal. This I shall follow, as it were, from his notion of the state of nature, man in the state of nature, the social contract, and the formation of what he calls the civil government. But first, one needs to locate John Locke's epistemology or epistemological thinking that acted as his foundation into his political craftsmanship. And friends, let's take a little bit time to understand John Locke's epistemology and how that blends into his political thought. John Locke's epistemology is a coordination of logic and historical thought. It is this double effect in the epistemological founding of the state and governance that characterizes John Locke's corpus. Within this tradition, John Locke establishes his political thought and from the argument that our sources of knowledge is actually sensation and perception, and that none of our knowledge antedate experience. Perception, Locke argues, is the first step and degree towards knowledge, an inlet of all the materials therein. To this, he establishes the doctrine of primary and secondary qualities. And to him, the primary qualities is inseparable from the body. And this is solidity, extension, figure, motion, to mention. While secondary qualities are colors, sound, smell. Such are, for example, without the eyes, there will be no colors. Without the nose, no smell. Chapter 3 of General Terms turns to the subject of universals, where Locke confronts it, arguing that all things that exist are particulars, but that we can frame general ideas such as man, that is applicable to many particulars. In chapter 6 of book 3 of the Names of Substances, Locke turns his attack on refuting the claims of the scholastics with regards to their doctrine on essence. To Locke, things may have a real essence, but this, in the main or by large, is unknown to us. However, what is more important from the domain of his epistemology is Book 4, which I invite you to read a little bit more, chapter 1. And this Book 4 introduces us into John Locke's contradiction in his notion of tabula rasa and innate ideas. Earlier on, John Locke had fashioned reason and innate ideas as constitutive core element for human beingness, rights, and social contract. Secondly, as Philip Scuella, bishop, points while citing Sapolsky, Robert, John Locke had given an impression that wherever and whenever a condition exists, other than internal free conditions, it runs the very real risk of fascism, totalitarianism, and dictatorship. Arising from this contradiction, Locke quickly sets forth a kind of a synthesis, using the notion of imagination to create ideas of entity that have no existence in reality. What is clear from this contradiction is not necessarily an epistemological question, but more a political epistemology. John Locke had a task, namely, to justify tabula rasa. And tabula rasa here is to talk about an empty slate. Tabula, like a slate. Rasa is empty. And the operations of the political institutions over and above individual volition, but with some unprecedented difficulties. The difficulty arises from his earlier submission that the civil society so formed as a result of the social contract was out of free will and for the purpose of protection, respect, and promotion of life, liberty, and property, but by the state and the government. In other words, it was to paint the civil society as naturally necessary given the natural impulse. But again, and as I said earlier on, the cardinal object was to institutionalize the civil society, and as a result, John Locke needed to find an epistemology that suits this task, an epistemology which he finds in his phraseology, tabula rasa. This is the genesis of the contradiction, with one part set in motion to legitimize and consolidate the civil society as led by the state and the governmental institutions, with an argument that the people so ruled have an empty mind, an empty head that needed to be helped. Once the human being is empty, or a clean sheet, in effect, John Locke allows anything to be written on. Here, the notion tabula rasa is not so much an epistemological issue, or that it is untrue, but that it becomes a political technique to institutionalize a political value. The real problem here is an image built on the normal transfer and translation of knowledge from outside, particularly from the state and government, whose role is to convince the lot of people with certain kinds of what Locke would say authentic and standardized copy of knowledge that comes from the civil society. And this civil society now institutionalized in the name of the state. Drawing from this caricature, one sees a power relation between the empty container, who are the people, oi polloi, and a modern-day notion of dictatorship and patronage engineering, where there is a vertical transcendental character in which one is over and above the rest, reigning on them, and does not only wet his subjects, but suggests that the act of wetting is good because it quenches the thirst and simultaneously washes the dirt from the residues filling into the container. Except this time, not on the body, but the mind. To consolidate this relationship, John Locke uses consent to mean two things, therefore. The idea of being lumped together and acceptance of a body to govern, namely the state and government. The second bit is the prerogative power, where the power that be retains the power to suspend the law whenever it thinks necessary and in the so-called public interest. The prerogative notion actually meant an exception, that the civil society, or now the state, had been entrusted the enforcement of the law and could at its will decide or can put aside the same law using the prerogative to enforce. To understand this point, the section that follows begins with his theory of the state of nature, man in a state of nature, the social contract, and the subsequent formation of the civil society or the state and government. The Lockean state of nature makes fundamental assumptions as building blocks. It starts by saying, to understand political power right and derive it from its original, we must consider what state all men are naturally in, and that is a state of perfect freedom to order the actions and dispose of their possessions and persons within the bounds of the law of nature. A state also of wherein creatures of the same species are equal one amongst another without subordination or subjection. It continues, but although this be a state of liberty, yet it is not a state of license. The state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and reason which is that law teaches all mankind that all are equal and independent. Not one ought to harm the other. The execution of the law of nature is, in that state, put into every man's hands, where by everyone we say everyone has a right to punish the transgressor of that law to such a degree as may hinder its violation. It starts from this quotation or citation by painting a bright light and color around state of nature and man in the state of nature as peaceful, with strong regard for each other. It should be noted here, however, that it becomes extremely difficult to place Locke's state of nature in a definite mark as romantic or realistic. But it seems both are correct in measure and appropriateness. In one sense, Locke sounded romantic because the state of nature was good through and through, while he was realistic because in the state of nature it was also the state in which men use prerogative to protect one's liberty and quite often than not bound to cause discomfort or disturbance of the other. However, we should note the state of nature is an imaginary, pre-political condition, not only performed as a useful function in the speculative system of Locke and an attempt to overcome the authority of the masses, but also allowed Locke to use an analog of his conception of the mind as tabula rasa. In a much important note, Locke's notion of the state of nature is concerned majorly with the source which makes power legitimate and how power can be prevented from becoming arbitrary. Conceivably, Locke begins this construction of state of nature by describing it as the state where men are created as equal by God. Here, Locke's picture of the state of nature is more stable, considering an earlier version from Thomas Hobbes, that every man against every man. Comparatively, therefore, Locke's man in a state of nature or pre-political was so-called a moral being, living in happiness, rational, tolerant, pleasant, and one of peace, goodwill, preservation, in which all power and jurisdiction is reciprocal. This state, as beautifully woven by Locke, is according to him a state in which man lives together without authority, without common law, and without a judge. The state of nature, however, is a state of license, and the natural liberty of man is to have only the law of nature to reign. However, it is quite interesting to see how Locke, in a space of such a short time of celebrating his state of nature, problematizes it in what he calls the state of war. In other words, Locke uses this stage as a convenient frame to justify his journey into the civil government as shown. And I want to quote, "It being reasonable and just, I should have a right to destroy that which threatens me with destruction. For by the fundamental law of nature, man being to be preserved as much as possible, because he who attempts to get another man into his absolute power thereby puts himself into a state of war with him. For nobody can desire to have me in his absolute power, unless it be to compel me by force to that which is against the right of my freedom. So, he who makes an attempt to enslave me thereby puts himself into a state of war with me." Looking for a solution out of this situation, Locke remarks, "To avoid this state of war is one great reason for men's putting themselves into society and quitting the state of nature. For where there is an authority, a power on earth from which appeal can be made, there the continuance of the state of war is excluded." End of quote. So, the good state of nature painted by Locke could easily turn into war or a state of war, when two or more either declare war by stealing from each other and trying to make the other one a slave. Besides, as a state of nature lacks civil authority, once war begins, it's likely to continue. And to avoid this, Locke decides that man needed to abandon the state of nature and enter a contract to form a civil government. In the next section, we want to look at this idea of a contract, what we are calling the social contract, and the formation of the civil government. The theory of the social contract, as used by John Locke and earlier on by his predecessor Thomas Hobbes, has roots in Greek philosophy. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all utilized the idea of social contract in one form or the other. For example, in Crito, Plato recognized the role of social contract, although in a non-theoretical sense, as shown in Socrates' contemplation on a possible escape from prison. While Aristotle concluded that men form political association not simply for mere survival, but rather to pursue a common good. Leveraging on the point that the biblical Adam had not either by natural right or fatherhood or by positive donation been given by God any such authority over his children or dominion over the world, it became impossible that the rulers now on earth should make any benefit or derive any, the least shadow of authority from that. This leads Locke to logically proceed that the liberty of man in a society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the Commonwealth. It is not under the dominion of any will or restraint of any law, but what that legislator shall enact. It is according to the trust put in it, not liberty, for everyone to do what he likes or live as he pleases, but to have a standing rule to live by, which is common to everyone of that society. And that created the Locke's or the Lockean social contract. Locke begins this textual discussion with a thoroughgoing warning and a passionate defense for consent, that no one can be put out of his estate and subjected to the political power of another without his consent. The only way whereby anyone divests himself of his natural liberty and puts on the bonds of civil society is by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceful living, one with the other. The same act, therefore, whereby anyone unites his person to any commonwealth by the same, he also unites his possession, and they become both of them, person and possession, subject to government of that commonwealth. John Locke, like any other theorist, starts with a realistic examination of the human condition absent from any structured social order. He was unable to explain political order without the social contract because the social contract was actually needed or required in Locke's frame to supplement his concept of the law of nature and what standards were there to establish a state and government. Like all social contract thinkers, John Locke was persuaded that the political was not an essential attribute of man, but an accident. So, no political rule could be based by nature because nature is pre-political, unless a transition from the pre-political through the social contract into the political. Feeling complete in establishing the notion of social contract, John Locke now takes us into the foundation or detail of the contract. Let us focus on it and discover certain salient traits. In a cautious start and an emphasis on consent, Locke starts off with a statement of emphasis that one cannot be put out of his estate, as I quote, and be subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. By the same act, therefore, whoever therefore enjoys any part of the land, so annexed to and under the government of that commonwealth, must be, with the condition, as it were, agreed by first the person or the individual and the government. However, we want to state here that Locke's social contract is simply hypothetical and designed as an analog to justify the legitimacy of principles and practices on which Western societies founded governmental systems. However, this hypothetical analog is prospectively stretched too far, as if it were a factual reality, and so creating the logical gap between the intention and the actual outcome of the contract. In other words, the state of nature was for Locke a conceptual apparatus to his concept of life, liberty, and estate, which in modern sense we would qualify him as an ardent supporter of the laws of thought. In brief, far from describing an orderly and peaceful state of nature, Locke actually intended to describe a natural state where conditions are stark and dismal that individuals willingly want to escape it and form a government. Arising from the social contract, Locke's notion of a people's sovereignty is more a rhetorical veneer of legitimacy to encourage a mute population with a false feeling of sovereignty. This is clearly noticed in his additional discipline, namely, so-called principle of representation, which means not the sovereign power of the people as such, but that it is the will of the people as embodied by the so-called representative, who is a political actor who acts on behalf of the people, quoting people to identify their will with the person they are taking to represent them. If at all people concern themselves with political matters, then it is as far as people are able to hover above the political life of government or a state, simply through the representative. The notion of being above undoubtedly troubles us because it indicates of necessity that people, as a constituent power, as Locke wanted us to believe, are actually outside normal politics. That would also imply that Locke's sovereign, the so-called people, are actually partially within government and partially outside government. Meaning, the representatives are actually closer or in government as the sovereign, so-called sovereign people, and are more and more in, and the so-called sovereign people actually are more and more excluded. To complicate the matter, Locke introduces another value in his political language, namely the theory of the prerogative. This is introduced almost immediately and side by side with his theory of sovereign exception through the prerogatives. Locke's excuse here is that natural law sometimes is inadequate, and so sovereign exceptionalism is an exceptional circumstance that complements the missing line that natural law is to perform. To see the gravity of this issue and put Locke into perspective, one needs to be reminded that the prerogative of power is the capacity to act as an authority or a political entity, or as a government outside of the law and even against it. In response to what Locke calls accidents and necessities. Oren Gross, in support of Locke, argues that going completely outside the law in appropriate cases preserves rather than undermines the rule of law, in a way that bending the law is to accommodate catastrophes. Regardless of choice of words, Locke develops a real big tensional relationship between three poles: legality, executive discretion, and people's power. Avoiding the embarrassment of Locke being presented as a dictator and anti-democratic, Vicente Medina tries to keep the label in a mild form, and he says, Lockean prerogative resembles the concept of commissarial dictatorship, that is, a situation when one is commissioned to act according to the constituted power, to preserve and or to restore such an order. At this point, I reserve my comment until we scrutinize it, most singular issue, namely property. Consequently, the next section is dedicated to his most important single core interest, the property or estate. And we want to examine this to see how the phrase is used to expose his real intention, the phrase property or estate, to expose Locke's real intention. In chapter 5, Locke's premise was that God gave the earth and its fruits in common to men for their use. But the problem Locke actually faced was to explain how commonly available resources could become legitimate private property, which excludes the right of other men. He begins to tackle this challenge by identifying the one form of property against which no other man could possibly claim, and that is the property each man has in his own person, that is, labor. To this, Locke cited for what he considered as a systematic explanation, and came to believe that his infamous thesis that natural resources, while mixed with natural labor, would constitute such a required explanation. He muses, though the earth and all inferior creatures be common to all men, yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has a right to but himself. And this is labor. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, is properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature has provided, he has mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. To build this, Locke, in a completely open and a passionate interest in legitimizing individual property holding, adds a higher level of his sophistry to their natural conclusion to appear correct. Let us look at this case scenario. God, Locke says, gave the world to men in common. It cannot be supposed he meant it should always remain common and uncultivated. It being by him removed from the common state, which nature has placed it in, it has by his labor something annexed to it. That excludes, and that excludes the common right of other men. Locke, at this point, is heavily haunted by his own scheme. And to shed off this, and in view of his fears for having been a lot clearer about his possessive individualism, creates a soothing picture and a courting language to neutralize those who could possibly be pessimistic about the scenario and unfavorable competition. This he does in the following conversation, and I want to cite. Nor was this appropriation of any parcel of land, by improving it, any prejudice to any other man, since there was still enough, you also go and get. And as good is still left, and more than yet unprovided, could be used by anybody who wants. In effect, there was never the less. There was more and more left for others. Because of his enclosure from himself, for himself doesn't mean that all is gone. For that had as good which is left for others who still need. And therefore nobody should complain or meddle with what I have already improved by my labor. For if you need, you also mix your labor with that which is naturally provided and naturally in abundance. As Wilmore Kendall clearly puts it, this is truly individualistic natural right to property, or what Locke would call person's right to property. Is not only ownership, but it creates an inviolable right to it. But more importantly, from his epistemology, that all knowledge is acquired since we are born with an empty mind, tabula rasa, Locke actually did not believe in natural law but conventional law. From this point that we are born with an empty mind, Locke is saying we are also born without property. Unless you decide to fill your empty mind, unless you decide to fill yourself with property, then it becomes yours. That means his notion of a property is not actually a careful study and appreciation of natural endowment, but a manipulation of the religious fervor of the time on eternal God to build his most craved notion of individual ownership. This made Leo Strauss to conclude that although Locke used the natural law notion in his property conversation, the language was simply a cover that allowed him to convey his true message of a bourgeois dictatorship, while avoiding hostility on the part of the majority workers as well as the readers. Locke's notion of inalienable rights is therefore a character of a property concept. To try and dissuade the moral sense of shame, Locke tries to provide for pseudo restrictions that one may only appropriate as much as one can use before it spoils. Second, one must leave enough as good for others. And third, one may only appropriate property through one's own labor. But it is important to note that as the argument progresses, each of these restrictions is transcended because with the invention of money, value can be stored, and so restriction on spoilage and wastage cannot work. Locke's phraseology, the turf my servant has cut can become my property, therefore collapses his original sense of labor and clearly shows that labor can be alienated as well, an area that Karl Marx was to elaborate in depth and scale. Locke's attempt, therefore, to ground the right to property on natural law was actually an important device for asserting the rights of individual, but because the consequences of property holding and competition brings dispute and increasing concern for personal safety, this explains the insistence on why Locke decides to create a state and government. So, the ownership of private property is the central cause of the existence of the state and government. Locke's hidden agenda becomes apparent, namely, people relating to each other as owners and the individual freedom as a sum total of the proprietors. This also showed that Locke is a secret Thomas Hobbesian or Thomas Hobbes and a capitalist apologist by the possessive nature of his individualism. In a well-summarized thought of C.B. Macpherson, Locke is actually a defender of an unrestricted capitalist accumulation of resources. Locke's conversation of inalienable rights is a property concept and not necessarily a rights concept. It is also a manifesto that creates the dictatorship of the bourgeois and creates the worker or the proletariat. In other words, there is much textual evidence that even after the establishment of a government, Locke mainly envisioned government as a means of protecting property. To him, good governance actually meant how government fulfills the responsibility of protection and regulating property and making it secure. If government fails in this respect, then it is not only bad a government, but citizens, and citizens in quote, which means basically the bourgeois, can spur through the workers or the proletariat a revolt or a change of government. Meaning, the search to maintain the right and convenience of a property caused, defined, and judges a civil government. By and large, John Locke's rhetoric was to ensure a covert entrenchment of the central position of the state and government. But more importantly, the effort was to deliver individuals' private judgment or private property. And that actually war, which earlier on hinted, or injustice, was around the question of property. At this point, it becomes abundantly clear that John Locke grants as supreme the interest around property protected by the state and government. And therein we see less and less interest on the masses, meaning it trivializes the interests of the masses. In conclusion, as it were, my presentation was to understand and lead us into understanding the deep-seated feelings and the substantive emotional and ideological attachment that Locke had, not for purposes of good governance, but in the creation of the regime of property and how it could be well protected, and because of a property that created the state and government, how the state and government could be shared among the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. I therefore offered a general critique of not only John Locke, but also Western thought. And that therefore means that as we read European or Western knowledge, it must be with a critical lens, with a critical eye, to avoid generalization, to avoid sweeping key issues under the carpet, but proceed more and more to the textual clarification, to establish the embedded, to establish the exactness, and be able to transgress that into a deeper understanding, to appreciate the rhetoric and the nuance that gives the exact meaning to the text. That means Western thought cannot be taken as such. Today, we start the process. Today, we start the procedure to begin to question Western thinking and to begin to talk to ourselves that it cannot be read holistically. It must be read contextually. It must be read within its background. It must be read within its history. Thank you.